At heart, I'm a data scientist, so most of my time is focused on the data we use and display, OpenStreetMap, satellite images, you name it. But equally important isn't just what data is used, but how it's rendered, especially online. So today, we're going to be nerding out on maps on the internet. Specifically, how back in 2008, a 20-something-year-old started what would become a career in mapping by making a simple map viewer on the browser to render OpenStreetMap. My guest today is Volodymyr Agafonkin, whose biggest contribution to mapping is the creation of Leaflet, proudly self-described as the simplest mapping library out there. It's safe to say that most maps you've seen online today use Leaflet, at least the ones showing static images. Volodymyr since then has been working at Mapbox since 2013, you guessed it, on map rendering. We nerd out on the trade-offs of map projections, code complexity, and everything that makes displaying maps both complicated and so endlessly interesting if, like me, nerding out on maps is the kind of stuff you find interesting. Now, if you go on the Leaflet map page today, at the time this episode is recorded in March 2024, you'll be treated with a pop-up that has very little to do with maps. Volodymyr is from Ukraine, which has been ravaged by a war for the past few years. The internet doesn't really have borders, and ironically, for a conversation on maps where borders are a big part of the work, this has meant Volodymyr and his family have had to leave their homes for months and now live in this new normal of bombs and strikes. This whole conversation, this whole podcast, is about telling the stories of the people behind the maps. And this war is a part of this story. This episode is sponsored by Kermap. They're behind Nimbo, a very easy-to-use platform showing beautiful cloud-free composites of satellite images over time around the world. I talk a lot about satellite images on this podcast, and that's probably no surprise, but I also often want to show people, especially those around me who aren't as familiar with satellite images, what they look like, and maybe more importantly, some specific changes over time. Nimbo is one of the easiest and simplest platforms out there to do this. Anyone can really just use it. In just a few clicks, you can make a render and a time series animation and easily compare images over time. They make monthly mosaics, stitching Sentinel-2 optical images together, creating a catalog over time that you can easily explore. You can log in at maps.nimbo.earth for free and just start browsing around, comparing images over time and just exploring the world, either in 2D or in 3D with elevations and mountains. I do want to highlight this. It is really easy to use. In a couple of clicks, you can export a GIF of change over time or individual images. They've made the UI incredibly simple, so I recommend you just go ahead and take a look for yourself at maps.nimbo.earth or send it over to someone who you've been trying to explain what the heck satellite images are, as anyone can really easily use this. This is, in my opinion, the biggest benefit of Nimbo. So head over to maps.nimbo.earth to try it out for yourself. And thank you to Kermap for sponsoring this episode. I don't know if you're aware, I like starting these conversations the same way every single time. I like asking people how they would describe themselves. So I'm quite curious, how would you describe yourself?
I'm a software engineer. I specialize in mapping software, building the future of maps. I created Leaflet, the industry standard for maps, and have worked on Mapbox GeoJS for the last 10 years. I built a lot of open source projects related to computational geometry, data visualization, and maps. And besides that, I'm a musician. I'm leading a rock band called Obima Dashu. Um, and I'm a father of twin girls, which are almost 10 years old. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
that's me.
I I like that's how you describe yourself, like on working on the future of maps. One of the reasons I'm excited to talk together is like that was not always the case. You were not always into mapping, and I feel like you kind of accidentally stumbled upon it. And so I'd love to dive into the story of Leaflet, which is now like everywhere. Um, but could you take me back to the beginning of like how it started and maybe also why you started it?
So it was year 2008. I was working for a typical outsourcing company in Ukraine, and we have a pretty strong outsourcing industry. And I just finished working on a project, and we were waiting for a new one coming from UK, some new startup called Cloudmade. And there's always this kind of period between clients when it's called sitting on a bench, when you're just doing nothing for a few weeks, maybe like catch up on some skills or something. But I was really curious to know what that next project will be. So I started Googling and reading their press releases and everything. And I discovered that this is a startup based on OpenStreetMap data. And OpenStreetMap is this super exciting project, which I never heard before, but that sounds incredible. Like building a collective map of the world with crowdsourcing, a map that's like free and open for everyone. Yeah, that just sounds super exciting for someone who's fresh out of university and so far has worked on really really boring stuff. Like my previous project was some enterprise Java like mobile networks thing, and I was really really bored. So during that bench time, I started like researching mapping and OpenStreetMap, and I knew nothing about maps. So like on the surface, it seemed pretty simple. So you have those like square images, and you load them, and you can drag them with a mouse a little bit, and maybe change the scale, and maybe put some icons on top. And basically, this is what mapping was to me back then. I was really naive, and I was like 22 years old, so pretty young. So just from the excitement, I started writing my own like mapping library in JavaScript. I just wanted to try it to figure out the math and just get something working. And I built this really simple, like 300 line code, which just loaded OpenStreetMap tiles and allowed you to drag them and zoom in and out. So kind of like the most basic version of a JavaScript mapping library. And then the clients came over to Kiev to meet the team, and immediately I went to them to tell them how excited I was to work at such a cool company with such a like cool premise. And I showed them my little prototype, and they were blown away. They didn't expect it. They expected to wind up slowly, like traditional outsourcing. It usually doesn't happen that someone is so excited to work on your new idea that they built something already without even talking to them once. So so they knew in that moment that I was the right person to like give me the responsibility of taking on building a JavaScript API for their startups, for their mapping services. That's what I was set out to do. And I really wanted to continue with that little prototype, like to continue developing it. But the management said, "Oh, actually, there's this existing open source library, which is really mature. It's there for many years. Everyone uses it, and we don't want to take risks, reinvent the wheel. We just want to." Get it going. So just take this existing library and build an API with it. And I started looking into what that library was, and I was absolutely shocked because my notions of what like a mapping library should be were shattered with this incredible complexity. I was shocked that like this library had like hundreds of different formats and hundreds of features and words that I didn't even understand. I thought that maps are simple. You just like square images and you drag them around and that's it. And turns out that this is this whole super complicated thing, and I I wanted to get away from complicated things. Really liked technology that is simple and straightforward and understandable and elegant. So I had this deadline to finish the first iteration of the JavaScript API for maps, and I decided, well, I have plenty of time. I can do this kind of wrapper around this library, open layers, and also I can finish my own thing, and I'll have both, and I can at the last moment choose which one to present. So I did, and in 2 weeks I presented the management with my first version of the Cloudmade mapping API. They tried it and they were shocked to see that for some reason it's really fast. Like there's no lag anywhere. Like you can drag the map and it just works really fast. Nothing's stuttering. It loads instantly. And hey, how did you make open layers work so fast? And then I had to confess, oh, actually, I built my own thing. I didn't listen to you, but I was so excited. I believed in this idea so much that I wanted to try it out. So I did, and there was a difficult conversation afterwards. When management tried to to figure out why I didn't listen to what they were saying, but and did my own thing anyway. But I didn't have a good English speaking skills back then, so and maybe not enough confidence to talk freely with a foreign leadership of a company. So somehow, I don't know how, I don't remember, it was such a long time ago, but I convinced them that, look, this can be a competitive advantage. This thing is really fast and we don't need much. We don't need all those complicated formats. We just need a simple mapping API with map tiles, with maybe some uh, markers on top, maybe some lines for navigation, and we don't need that much more. So why don't we go with this simpler solution, which is much faster, and we can present it as something that no one has. So that's how this we called it Web Maps Lite. It was our Cloudmade mapping API. It was proprietary and closed source for the first few years of its development, and it was pretty successful. People really liked it. They appreciated how lightweight and fast it is and simple. I took a lot of inspiration from Google Maps API actually. So it followed the conventions pretty closely, but yeah.
But that arrived probably a little bit later, because you're saying this is 2008. There's no Google Maps yet in 2008, is there? I don't remember the exact timeline.
I think there was some kind of a first version around that time.
I also wanted to add some context, like Cloudmade. I keep forgetting the exact name. Cloudmade, that's the company that Steve Coast started, like the founder of OpenStreetMap. Like it's not just some company around OpenStreetMap. It's the company that they built trying to make a business supporting OpenStreetMap. So it's already people that were trying to do things differently. Like Steve Coast is a whole other character that's does things his own way.
So it was a really interesting company to work for, and I think most of the early employees of Cloudmade. So we had this development team based in Kiev, Ukraine, and we had also a team in London. And that team was mostly early OpenStreetMap enthusiasts that Steve hired to develop this idea. So lots of big names from OpenStreetMap that were early Cloudmade employees. Like for example, Andy, the guy behind OpenCycleMap, Sean McDonald, many others. I'm not very good at remembering names, but and I really, some of my fondest memories of that time is that we would have company mapping parties in Kiev, where the London team would fly out to Kiev, and we would organize, like, for the whole day. Instead of working, we would go and have a long walk all around the city, with like GPS devices. There were no smartphones back then, so we like, the company got us like those small GPS devices to record traces in, and then like make some photos, make some notes. There were also like paper maps project. I remember was very useful. Being able to like print something and then add notes, and then like scan and upload them to JOSM. JOSM was the primary uh, map editor for OpenStreetMap. Well, it is now also, but back then I think it was the the only option. And yeah, we would update the map of Kiev. And OpenStreetMap back then, especially in Eastern Europe, it was not very well developed. It was only starting to get traction. So it was pretty cool to be like in the early stages of something that would become big eventually. And the same goes for when I joined Mapbox 5 years later. So I guess I'm really lucky in this way.
How does I want to get to the Mapbox a little bit later, but first of all, you mentioned you make this first uh, visualization library, like to mapping library, but it's closed. How do we go from that to having Leaflet, which is open?
Yeah, so that's also an interesting story. Development of this library was going for a few years, and at some point, I started feeling that it's pretty difficult to develop it on my own. Uh, and it was happening like during a period of web development time when browsers were changing really fast, and it was very hard to keep up with all the browser bugs or new features that browsers were introducing, and keep like compatibility with old browsers like Internet Explorer 5.5 or something like that. So and since I was the only one responsible for this JavaScript API in the company, I started thinking like, what if we could, I don't know, maybe make it open source? And GitHub started getting popular somewhere around that time. So I was fascinated by the idea of open source and of like this community effort to improve software, uh, like people from around the world just coming to improve your code. So that sounded really nice, and it felt a little bit lonely developing something on your own. And I really wanted to share this code with the world, because I felt like it was a really good product and really well written code. There was one breaking point. I remember that some guy who used this library wrote me an email and said like, "Hey, I know that you're like the main developer of Web Maps Lite, and we had this bug, and so I reverse engineered your code, and I made a patch, and here I'm sending you a patch to fix this bug." and, and I'm like, so our library is distributed like in this obfuscated, compressed way, and someone went to great lengths to like unobfuscated make a patch and send it to me. And like, imagine what would happen if this was open source and free for anyone to send patches, like how great this could become. And I, yeah, started thinking obsessively about this idea, and eventually I wrote like composed a really long letter, like with like 10 or 15 items, arguments like why we should open source web maps lite. uh, and I listed things like this would be like great for karma, developer karma, like for promoting the company, and clients are much less hesitant to use an open source client than a closed one, and then that gives customers more flexibility and yada yada, and like we would get external contributions and it would get developed and everything. So I made this long letter and I sent it to the management of Cloudmade. And sat with my fingers crossed, and eventually they replied like, yeah, that sounds good, let's do it. So that was my big win, and I started preparing the library for open sourcing, and in the process I rewrote it from scratch because I was really like anxious about publishing this code. I wanted it to be perfect, so I like rethought the whole architecture to make everything very elegant. I guess this is like a kind of I have some kind of OCD related to code. I I really like my code to be like very elegant and nicely written, and like I strive for this perfectionism. We're writing something, and unlike when you're developing like end user products, where like speed may be a more important factor, build something quickly. When you're developing software for other developers, um, it's very important to get it right, because any mistake, any inefficiency you make, it gets multiplied many thousands of times over in all customers' products. So I wanted to get it right, and eventually I uh, published it as Leaflet on GitHub, and it took off very quickly, because there was already like a certain community around Webmaps Lite, because people enjoyed the performance and how like well it worked all across all browsers. Another selling point was that it was the first mapping library to work really well on mobile phones. Like iPhones started taking off around that time, and I was, I guess, one of the first to make it really smoothly working on iPhones. So with some, there were some tricks to make it like hardware accelerated and some, like make it go really smoothly, as opposed to other existing libraries at the time. So people were sold, and it started getting traction really fast. Like I remember being in a complete like oh when I heard that Foursquare switched to Leaflet as the mapping library, and that was like wow, like big companies start using this. It's amazing. I also started getting like patches, fixing bugs, and yeah, it was a dream come true for an open source maintainer. So that's how Leaflet was born.
How does it go from working on your own and like really using like OCD on code, like having this deep passion, and then you open it to the rest of the world? Like, how do you maintain, or do you like maintain that culture of like, we need to do this properly? Because it's one thing to do that on your own and to, you know, have everything in your head and see like this is how it should work, and then you put it out to the world. Um, how do you get people to collaborate on a project like that and maintaining this high quality?
Well, first, I think I put out a kind of a mission statement pretty early in the
Right.
project history that described Leaflet as being this like intentionally uh, minimal library focused on performance and lightweight, and saying that new features will be scrutinized heavily, and will try to remove features where possible, and will leave all the additional functionality for the community to build plugins for, instead of adding it to the core library. So kind of the opposite philosophy to open layers at the time, that just to added any feature you could think of. And back then, when I started working on a mapping library, OpenLayers already had 1 megabyte of JavaScript in its code, hundreds of thousands of lines of code, and it was a massive amount back then. It's now. 16 years later, it's not a big deal if you load few megabytes of JavaScript on a web page. But back then, your page browser freezed, your computer would go 100% CPU, and everything would be super slow. So it was important to have this lightweight, and to reject non-essential features. So I developed this kind of philosophy of focusing on the most important features, making them right. And that was my first talk in English, actually, when I went to Phosphogy conference in Minneapolis. That was my first ever international conference, was in 2013. And that's where I presented Leaflet and my philosophy around it. And I think the talk was called "Simplicity in GIS" or something like that. I guess you can find the video now somewhere on Vimeo. So yeah, that's what I tried to propagate early in the project, and I would have very strict pull request reviews, and try to only accept smaller contributions. So, and it's a hard balance. At some point, you have to let it go. uh, it's difficult, but I guess with experience and time, you learn to trust other people, especially if you've worked with them for some time. And I'm extremely grateful for people that I met through Leaflet that stepped up and eventually became maintainers of Leaflet. So I'm remaining so-called benevolent dictator, but I trust other people for maintenance of day-to-day Leaflet.
That's also something I was curious about. So, yeah, we're at 16 years since the project started. Started as a part of consulting for Cloudmade. That company is no longer around, and it hasn't been around for a while, right?
Uh, Not exactly, and that's
Okay.
also very interesting. So back when I left Cloudmate in 2013, and there was a period of time where many people left the company because it felt like it was kind of crumbling, and building a mapping company is incredibly difficult, but it was almost impossible back then when OpenStreetMap wasn't as developed. Companies had much less trust in OpenStreetMap data quality, and yeah, building a business was really really hard. So Cloudmate was struggling, and they decided to pivot, try explore in all direction, trying to find something that would work. Maybe not. So they tried this classical we sell mapping services, and it didn't work out. So they pivoted. And when I left, together with other people who left, I remember that we would put bets oh, how long do you think Cloudmate will last? I think it will be like 1 year. Oh no, I think it will be like 3 months top. And turns out Cloudmate is doing great. They
Okay.
pivoted eventually. They pivoted to automotive.
Okay. Oh, I wasn't aware of that. Okay.
They started developing advanced UIs and software for like dashboards inside cars. They started getting like really lucrative contracts with like big automotive customers, and eventually, I think like last year or maybe like a few months ago, they got acquired by some big automotive conglomerate, uh, and they are doing great. And this is very interesting to me because Mailbox is it also tried really really hard. It tried to build like a mapping company based on OpenStreetMap and open data. It struggled to build a business, and it pivoted to extend its reach, and in particular it pivoted to automotive companies as well. And now Mailbox is doing pretty well and has like really big contracts with like some of the biggest car manufacturers in the world. So with Mailbox maps appearing in cars you drive, so
Interesting.
it's
Yeah.
kind of a cycle.
Yeah. And so what's Leaflet life in the meantime? Because in 2013, I think, is when you joined Mapbox as well.
Yeah.
So what happens around that time with Leaflet? Because that kind of, I'm guessing, takes a life on its own. But I'm curious about something that started as part of your job. Like, does it still continue to be your job, or is it something that you continue to work on the side? And this is also a question around like, funding and financing and making projects like these sustainable. It's kind of this big lump of a question, but I'm really curious what happens in the next few years.
Back when I joined Mailbox, I joined Mailbox because Leaflet was so successful that mapping companies started using it, and Mapbox was like the mapping company to work for. At the time, it was like a dream job for anyone related to maps because it was like a startup from those idealistic people who truly believed that you could build like super innovative business while keeping everything open source, like 100% of code open source, and base everything on open data. It was very radical. And Mapbox made quite a steer before I joined by like releasing all those amazing open source tools for the community, like TileMill. It also started hiring some of the like best talent in mapping across the world, and they were really heavily into remote works back when it wasn't as accepted as it is now. So, for example, they hired Artem Pavlenko, who's the creator of Mapnik, and like all maps were rendered by Mapnik at the time, like Google, everyone. So it was a big deal. Scene Giles was hired at the same time as me, the creator of Rasterio, and like one of the
Oh
big
yeah.
names in like raster processing and satellite imagery world. So yeah, Mapbox was hiring like the best mapping talent all across the world, and I was ecstatic to join. And at first, I thought that I would be hired to continue working on Leaflet full time because Mapbox was switching to Leaflet as its primary API at the time. But when I joined, I learned that actually they have this secret project brewing of uh, building a vector rendering engine, an open source one, which would someday replace raster based maps like Leaflet completely. And like, you can imagine how radical of an idea that was back then in 2013, when like WebGL wasn't even supported universally. Like it was only on very cutting edge browsers, and it was like uncharted territory. No one did this kind of stuff at the time. So and I started working on that as well, and
Let
here I
me
am 10 years.
I
Yeah.
want to dive into that. This is something I'm not as familiar. So I want to dive into that a little bit more. So up until that point, all the mapping library are loading images. It's rasters. That's what you're saying. And so even Leaflet, it's calling in different images that are rendered in many different ways, but what you're showing are images. And so what you're talking about is here in 2013, there's this project to move away from that to geometries, polygons, points that would then scale depending on how you move. Like that's the change that we're talking about at that time.
Yes, but more complicated than that. So
Okay.
leaflets could render vector data at the time, but it was only basic vector data, like some polylines, some polygons. But when we're talking about map rendering specifically, like base map rendering, it gets like hundreds of times more complicated because, for one, it like there's like a lot more data to render, and this is extremely expensive. So like hundreds of thousands of points, like because when you're looking at a map, a typical base map, like where there are like hundreds of streets all at
Mm-hmm.
once, and you have those hundreds of labels, and there's like this label collision that makes sure that labels don't overlap, and so like all kinds of like patterns and symbology and various things that make map rendering look good and detailed at the same time. So this was easier to do on the server side, and it was done on the server side because for a particular map view, you could like do all the calculations, however long they took, generate this one image, cache it on the server, and it would get fetched to be shown on the client by things like Leaflet. But when you're rendering something on the client, like all this raw data, all those buildings, all those roads, you have to do it like 60 frames per second. You don't have like an hour to generate like a bunch of images. You need to render them like right there in like 16 milliseconds every view. And this is that turns out that like it's a very deep and complicated problem that involves a ton of computational geometry, math, a lot of algorithms, a lot of data structures, um, GPU shaders, like a lot of like hardcore computer science. And when I started getting into this, of course, I was blown away, and it got so interesting that I'm still doing it 10 years later. It's like it's super fascinating subject, and you can never like get it perfect. You always have things to improve, uh, and th- things are more complicated because. When you're browsing an interactive map that is rendered in real time, you have to consider things like features not flickering too often, or like you have to like unlike static rendering of images, you have to consider much more like restrictions to make it smooth, to make it feel smooth. And yeah, it's hard to describe, but yeah, real-time rendering on the client is much more complicated than server-side rendering.
So why do it? Like it sounds like it's a huge amount of engineering to figure out why. And then you have Leaflet that seems like very simple on the other hand. For someone that like, likes the simplicity, like why would you ever do something like that?
So Mapbox wanted to push the boundaries of what's possible with maps, and that's what it is. Trying to expand the technology to do things that were not possible before. So, for example, with real-time rendering, you can change the style of the map on the fly. You can highlight data on the fly, change colors, change layers, change labels, do like animations, and add interactivity, like hovering on a building and like showing some information about it. So um, things like that. So like the vision was to enable a new kind of interactive, rich experiences with maps, which were not possible with static maps. And even the most basic things like rotation. Like if you generate maps on the server, you technically you can rotate them, but then the labels will be upside down, for example.
Oh yeah.
So things like that, like small details like that, they come up. And vector rendering, it enables so much more freedom of how you can approach those interactive experiences, and things like showing you a map when navigating in a car, for example. It can only be done with vector rendering because so you have like this pitched view, things update as you move. And the map rotates as like according to the car orientation, stuff like that. So
Yeah, so the analogy that really comes to mind is like you're basically recreating a mini video game where like people can move around in real time, but you have to do
right.
that in a browser. One thing I read a post that you wrote for Mapbox about like map projections and like trying to do different map projections. And there's one line that you wrote in there which is around like people are, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was along the lines of we're kind of conditioned to know what a map looks like. It's always north up, and if it's online, it's a web Mercator map. So there's this thing I think you write where people think that Greenland and Africa are the same size, but like one is 14 times bigger than the other one. I'm really curious when you start Leaflet, like you come in with no knowledge. I'm guessing there's so you use OpenStreetMap tiles, is that right? So you already have like you're not even thinking about north up and projections. You just use whatever they have and you're displaying it. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. And back then, only web Mercator would be used.
Yeah.
So any other projection would be extremely rare.
And where are we at today? Like let's nerd out about map projections a little bit because that's a fun topic. What is the like is that still what's being used? If not, like what are we using? What are the some of the trade-offs? Let's nerd out a little bit about map projections.
It gets pretty interesting when you try to apply like alternative projections to the context of an interactive map. Because the whole idea was developed for paper maps where you don't really change the scale. You generate one single map, which in a projection, which makes sense for this particular scale, whether this is like world scale or it's like centered around a particular country. It gets difficult translating this idea of picking the right projection to an interactive map because it depends. Like the right projection depends on on the scale and
Yeah.
on the zoom and things like that. So Mapbox came up with this idea of dynamic projections, where it starts on the world scale with a projection of your choosing, and then it gradually transforms it as you zoom in to Mercator, because when you're close enough, Mercator starts becoming the perfect projection for various reasons. But when you're like far out, it's always a matter of trade-offs, whether you want like relative sizes to be accurate, or you want angles preserved, or like distances preserved, and depending on that, you want to choose different projections, and like that depends on the use case.
So you guys are changing projections depending on the zoom level.
Kind of. We're like morphing one projection that you choose into a different one as you zoom in, and we were morphing it in a way that feels like smooth and natural. So
Right.
it was quite a cool innovation in my opinion, and that's why I wrote the blog post, even though I didn't come up with the idea. The idea was by Ansis Brahmanis, is a very good former colleague of mine, which I admire.
That's wild. Like this idea that like they're all trade-offs, but we're gonna morph them. I love this. It sounds like such a cool engineering solution to like, well, there's no good solution to this problem.
And
But then,
yeah, sorry.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
That's what mapping is. That's why it's so exciting, because there are so many unsolved problems in the mapping space, and if you're like a nerd trying to work on cool problems, mapping is the industry. Like there's so many cool things to solve there. It's just a infinite amount of technical challenges, and also what's so great about mapping is that it's visual, and I've always been attracted to things that you can see, like you work on something and then you can see the end result and it's pretty. uh, that makes it much more motivating than working on some like data processing challenge or something like that.
What do you think are, first of all, I completely agree. And yet here we are, we have a podcast which is mainly sound about maps. What do you think are some of the still main challenges of mapping? Like, what are you thinking about? Either things that you're working on or not. Like, what do you think are still some of the really big challenges in mapping today?
Well, the challenge that I'm constantly faced with, uh, and that I'm extremely worried about, is like this accumulation of complexity. This is something that I kind of started with when I created Leaflet, but it's a problem again, and this time with vector rendering technology. Like it kind of won in the industry. Like vector maps are the future. Even OpenStreetMap project is switching to like vector maps and vector tiles pretty soon. But it's really complicated, and it gets harder and harder to maintain this level of complexity in a technology. So especially when you're working on a library that has been in development for 10 years, and like with features constantly being added to it, and like hundreds of thousands of developers depending on existing functionality, so you can't really take anything away easily, and it just gets added and added, and the complexity grows and grows, and complexity grows in a non-linear fashion. It grows exponentially. So you add one feature, like like you add 10% of the code, but the whole project gets twice as complex. And it only gets worse, and it feels like you have this uphill battle. So I don't have a good solution for it. I only know one solution, which is start over from scratch and try to build it right this time. But in case of vector rendering technology, it's just too insurmountable of a challenge, because with Leaflet it was possible, because essentially it's a simple technology. You can implement it in a reasonable amount of lines of code without getting depressed. But if you're building a vector rendering engine from scratch, it's like many years of effort, which might get nowhere. So so I don't know. It's very hard. I don't know how this gets solved. And this, I think, is the biggest challenge from my perspective, because I'm mostly focused on like client side rendering. I don't know what's the biggest challenge on like other in other parts. I guess getting this like scalability right, so that for example, we could process like the ever growing number like amount of OpenStreetMap data or any kind of mapping data to like have up to date maps served in a cheap way. And this is something that many great map minds are working on today, like Brandon Liu of Proto Maps and PM Tiles fame, a project I really admire because it combines this like fundamentals of like trying to make things simple and easy, and in this way enable more people to enter the field and build more cool stuff. So that's happening on the like kind of server side tile processing world, but on the client side there are no easy solutions.
And you mentioned that you think the vector side is kind of won that war. What do you think is the future of something like Leaflet then?
I guess Leaflet will always be relevant because of how simple and easy it is, and like the vast majority of people who need to make a map, they don't need like those rich experiences or like high interactivity or like client side styling or like advanced rendering or rendering large scale data, any of that stuff. They just want to put some map, put a pin on it, and like 99% cases, that's it. So there will always be a need for something simple that gets people to make a map in one line of code without any difficulty.
I want to switch topic a little bit, and I want to start talking about this. Of At the moment we're recording this podcast, if you go on Leaflet's website, there's a I don't know, I forget if it's the main page or if there's a pop up that like
A pop-up.
I think you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
That says, hey, Leaflet started by people in Ukraine and there's a war that's going on. Like you're probably not here for that. You just probably want, to make a map, but like there's actually real people behind it. And so I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Like you've been quite vocal about that. You had to move for a little while. I think you told me you were back home now. Um, I want to ask a little bit about that. From a few angles, and then I'll let you kind of take it wherever you want. But you've mentioned, the early days of Mapbox, the early days of a lot of the mapping stuff. It came from people that wanted to make things accessible. Like maps started because there's borders as well. Like there's this whole geopolitical side that's attached to the tech that we're talking about. And then like you had to live through, a very real implication of some of those things. And so I'm curious, like I don't even know how to ask this question, but it's a topic that I've been wanting to talk about. And so maybe just to hand it over to you and know you've been thinking about that, about like your work and, what's going on in the country you're from.
um, there was no question, but
No, it's yeah, I'm sorry. It's not really a real question, but like maybe you can tell me like what's going on and if you've seen like the work you've done on Leaflet being impacted by the war, like being used to report on the war or things like that.
so yeah, I'm based in Kiev, Ukraine, and for the last 10 years there's been war waging by Russia, trying to like eliminate Ukraine and eliminate the nation and the state and absorb it. And this goes back centuries. Russia was always a colonial power trying to subjugate its neighbors and assimilate them, and in this way, they're like not different from what they did like many decades ago. Um, but two uh, 2 years ago, in 2022, it changed dramatically for me because they started a large scale invasion, trying to like conquer the whole country, and so like basically turn it into a concentration camp. Um, Killing off any kind of like democratic leanings in the country, and like turn it into a complete vassal uh, Russian power. So it's been terrible. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. I so it I remember the this day, 24th of February, really well. We Me and my wife woke up from an explosion at 5 a.m. and at first I thought that, oh, maybe there's this like maybe construction crane fell somewhere, or maybe something like that. But then I'm taking my phone, and like hundreds of messages like saying, oh, the war has started. So um, the first months have been very difficult, and because the Russian forces were advancing on Kiev, we had to flee with my wife and kids and a cat to western part of Ukraine, where we stayed for a few weeks. Then I sent my family to Poland to safety. They needed to recover for some time because like constant air alerts and like missile and missile bombings were like disrupting sleep heavily. You had to go to the shelter like constantly at night, like waking up. Yeah, it was a pretty terrible time, but Ukraine resisted. It fought back, and it got support from like all over the world. And uh, I got back, then my family got back, and I'm can I continue to work from Kiev, and it's because people adapt to any situations. It feels pretty normal for someone who's in a country at war. Like the biggest disruption is there are occasional missile and suicide drone strikes at night, but we have this rule of two walls. uh, we when it happens, we have an air alert, and we have time to prepare, so we can wake up the kids and move them to the hallway, where we have two thick walls between the outside and the inside, and we've set up a big bed there so they can sleep while the attack is ongoing and there are like some explosions outside. And we've used to it so much that like people sometimes like sleep through the explosions. um and also the like the notifications got so well, that sometimes like like, okay, there were cruise missiles launched from the Caspian Sea region, and they will take approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes to like reach Kiev. So I have time to go to the grocery store, maybe drop by, have some
Wow.
coffee in my favorite coffee place, and then I'll go to to the shelter. So in that case, like Ukrainians are very practical. The businesses are booming, people organized. So, like there's the volunteering culture here is absolutely mind blowing. I don't think people have seen anything like that. Like every Ukrainian donates huge amounts to the war effort, to the armed forces, and volunteers like ordering like drones and equipment and like humanitarian things and like medical supplies, and constantly supplying the front lines. I'm also uh, because I'm kind of like famous for mapping things in Ukraine. Uh, the military are sometimes reaching out, so like for consulting, because turns out maps are really important when you're having a war and planning operations and stuff like that. So I'm from time to time I'm consulting the military about mapping things, and the Ukrainian military is using both Leaflet and Mapbox and Maplibre. Uh, so plenty of expertise to share.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. I can imagine that's not the use case that you imagine when you get started on projects like these. Uh,
Yeah, I could never imagine that something like that would happen. I didn't believe it until the
yeah.
last moment. I thought that they would never dare, and because it was so self-destructive. But like um, people are crazy, so that this happens. It's unbelievable that it happens still in 2024. Um, but yeah, this happens. We adapt, and we continue like uh, building the future we want. And it's hard at times, but like with everything, humans adapt so quickly, and Ukrainians especially, because Ukrainians are unbelievably resilient nation. Like we've been through like genocides, famines, two world wars, where like yeah, so we are used to this kind of stuff in a way. So yeah, that's why I believe that will prevail eventually. It's just a matter of cost, like how long this goes on, and how many victims there will be, because like like thousands of civilians die and will continue to do so, because Russia is indiscriminate in its attacks. um, but we're resisting, and in the moment of crisis, like there's always this boom of innovation. The military tech sector is experiencing such growth in Ukraine. Like I'm sure after the war there will be like world leading military tech startups coming from Ukraine, like um, everywhere. And mapping tech as well, and like and drone tech like will be the leading force, because all those Western powers that are helping Ukraine, they don't have this kind of experience of large scale war. So in many ways, Ukrainians are more creative and resourceful and more advanced in technology uh, than than the Western powers. So um,
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing all of that. And you're back at home right now, like that's where you're calling me from.
yeah, I'm
Okay.
back at home. Uh, it's so good to be home.
Can imagine.
I left for like a month at months, but I missed it so much. And I returned as soon as I was able. When like the Russian forces were driven out of Kiev. I was wondering whether it was safe enough to get back. So I to like kind of satisfy my own anxiety, I built a data visualization of of air raid sirens. Like I parse Telegram notifications about air raid sirens, and build this like visualization that shows it on a time and date scale, to see like any plot patterns, or like whether it's getting less of an issue. And I saw that it's less intense now, and that helped me like make a decision to go back and convince my family to mm, come back as well.
And so, yeah, you're saying the day to day now is still some air raids, some bombings, but you just get used to it.
Yeah, it's air raids are every day. Not most of them are not that dangerous, but it's better to be cautious with things like that. But our people are so used to those, they now know how to differentiate, like they know how, like they can tell between like cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, suicide drones, the patterns and speeds of every weapon, and like how to prepare for each one, and what shelter is better for each one, and like things like that, like levels of threat you're experiencing. You get used to it. So um, my kids go to school as normal. They have shelters in school. So whenever there's an area, they just go down to some like basement like area, and they continue with their classes, and this is normal for them.
Well, hey, thanks. I really do appreciate you sharing that. That's a bit of a different day to day than mine, I have to admit. It makes me very grateful that I'm not affected as much by that, or even at all. Maybe it's a weird transition, but I still do want to ask. Like, I feel like this is a nice place to start rounding the conversation off. And I like asking about, book and podcast, maybe to change gears as well. But I wonder if there's anything that you've read or listened to recently that you think might be interesting for people to know about. It can be about really anything that we talked about today, or not. But if you're into reading and or listening to podcasts, if there's one of each that you think might be interesting for people to hear about.
Um, well, usually I don't like read books and listen to podcasts related to my work. I try to like go the opposite way. So I really love like listening to fiction audiobooks, autobiographies, and things like that. And with podcasts, I really like ones that have human stories in them. They're always great to listen to. So one of my favorites is Reply All, which is no longer there, but there's also Search Engine podcast, which I really like. It's also like kind of about human stories, interrelated with like tech. Um, and this is about podcasts, but Heavyweight is also another one which is a favorite. Um, but Recently I've been mostly focused on audiobooks. I can more easily find time and energy and focus for them. Like it's really hard to focus to read books in text in the last 2 years. Um, but like going outside and for long walks or runs really helps, and that's when I can turn on something to listen to, and that's when I consume most books nowadays. So the current one I'm listening to, which I absolutely love, is My Effing Life by Getty Lee. It's an autobiographical book by the founder of the Canadian rock band Rush. So it's really wonderful. It's a lot of stories about musicians' life, and Jewish humor, and yeah, it's just a wonderful time. I always enjoy listening to stories from real people I admire. Another one that I enjoyed in the same vein is The Storyteller by Dave Grohl, and those kinds of books are usually narrated by the authors, which makes it even more entertaining.
Yeah, I listened to that one as well, and I really liked it. Big fan of Dave Grohl. Um, Cool. Thanks. I'll have links to all of these. Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for your time. I really appreciate the conversation. I also like conversations with people. This is why I have them. I can relate to that. So thank you so much for your time, for sharing your story, both on the work that you've done and all the context behind it. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a really nice conversation.
Hey, thank you so much for listening to this conversation. I wanted to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, but also all the people who financially support me on Patreon. If everything goes well, these conversations should feel and sound seamless and effortless, but there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes. I try to research and prepare these as much as I can to know who these people are and what makes them interesting and what would lead to a good conversation. I'm incredibly thankful to all the people who support my work on Patreon, meaning I can do a little bit more of it. This podcast started out as a way to learn more about the people in this industry, but I've also started making educational content on another YouTube channel that I'll put a link to in the show notes. And I want to make more content explaining how satellite images and maps work to a broader audience, as well as continuing to research the guests for these podcast episodes. So if you value the work that I do, I'd like to ask you to please consider supporting my work on Patreon. There's also some behind the scenes of how this podcast is done and some of the work that I'm doing for these educational videos if you want to learn more about how I do all of this. Either way, thank you so much for all of your attention and your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope you get value from these conversations. Thanks.